Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to be painting this guy today. He's a forest goblin. Yeah, forest goblins are a little bit rare, a bit thin on the ground these days. In the old world, I think they do make an appearance as forest goblin spider riders, maybe? But generally speaking, the infantry, the archers, as well as the hand-to-hand combat infantry seem to have been, a little bit thin on the ground. I'm not sure why, because these are adorable. They're sort of, I guess it's the runaway popularity of night goblins in general. But for some reason, forest goblins as a species, they seem a lot a lot underrepresented in the war in just the Warhammer world in general. You don't really get to see them as much anymore, and for the most part, like I mentioned, you only really get like spiders. In fact, you see the spiders more than you see the actual forest goblins, which is a bit of a shame, really. I like the idea of in the past being able to do an entire army of forest goblins because these guys are so cute, right? They're sort of like the goblin equivalent of wood elves, right? As far as the elf species is concerned. So they've got their own esoteric way of war. They've clearly got a culture, their own language, their own quirks and perks, and I really like them about them in general. You really couldn't get many of them at the time, and I think other than this specific range of metal forest goblins, I don't think you were ever able to get the basic infantry in plastic at any point. Yeah, you had common goblins, you had night goblins making their way over to plastic during 5th edition, and later, these remain current all the way through. And then the next time you really get to see spider riders, other than these metals, you would get to see them as forest goblin spider riders in the battle for Skull Pass. Those were decent spiders, I feel, but they were not quite as cute as the original ones. And on this channel, I think we will get to paint some of these like original cute spiders, which I will show you, as well as going a little bit into a little bit more detail about the night goblins as well as the various units. Looking forward to painting masses of squigs and all the like. So it was a little bit unfortunate that we didn't really get to see much forest goblins a little bit beyond the early metal production figures. These ones, I mean, of course, the idea of collecting like goblins in metal always seemed a bit insane, right? Even though back in the day, I remember they used to come in blister packs in maybe groups of 5 at one point, which is a lot more than how it was with 4. In the old days, they used to give most infantry as 4, then gradually it became 3. But for the goblins, they started at 5, and then over time they dwindled to 4 because you would need to buy that extra blister pack just to cover, to get a nice round number of models, right? So that was part of the plan, I imagine. Might be a bit cynical of me to say so, but I believe Games Workshop as a business knew what they were doing, and I'm unwilling to countenance the idea that they kind of just stumbled into such an obvious mistake. I believe they set out to do what they wanted to do, and I think they've done right by the community insofar as when it came around to releasing the regiment boxes, they did much larger numbers, so that was a lot better than how things used to be in the past, I suppose. Anyway, forest goblins. So clearly, these guys are a lot less disciplined than your average goblins, such as that is, and as a result, the accoutrement that they bring into battle, just the gear, the equipment, just the armor or lack thereof, the sort of cultural touches and little fetishes on them are equally esoteric and quirky. And I love them for that because they're so unusual. All orcs and goblins are bald, right? Like there's not such a thing as an orc that gets born with a full head of hair, and at no point during their relatively short lives do they ever grow hair of any description, not the way we understand them as humans. So what they tend to resort to is wearing hair squigs. And this forest goblin model, who's a champion by the way, he's a unit leader, as you can tell by his like raising his weapon above his head kind of pose. He's got a hair squig. So that bizarre thing on top of his head that he's wearing, kind of like a headdress, That's not hair, and that's not a hat. There's a face over there. And he's got these bizarre little like tails that he uses to hold on to the head of your goblin. So that's kind of horrifying, but kind of adorable as well. He's got a bit of a symbiotic relationship with his hair pet. And hair squigs are I guess another factor in Warhammer lore that kind of has dwindled a little bit by the wayside. You don't really hear much mention about hair squigs anymore, but they are, just a really interesting aspect of orc culture. Squigs, of course, being that bizarre like subspecies of orc and goblin that seems to hang out in close proximity to orc and goblin camps. They're a source of food, they're a source of entertainment, they're a source of weapons of war. They can be driven directly into battle, or at least the larger species seem to be able to be driven directly into battle. They can be launched from catapults high overhead into the ranks of the enemy to cause all manner of harm in 40k, but oddly enough, not in Warhammer Fantasy. Yeah. So there were times, at least, where I personally was very invested with the idea of starting a Warhammer army based around this subculture of goblin. I think the idea of feather wearing, totem waving, chanting like forest goblins was always very appealing to me. Sort of like it sort of gives you a nice chance to like use all sorts of bright colors as well, and really kind of be experimental in the way you choose to paint things like fabrics. You could do them as leopard skin, for example, or zebra skin, and that really would add a lot of visual interest to the army as a whole. Plus, making them look a little bit wild and barbaric and esoteric, and that was always a sort of a missed opportunity that I saw when they failed to release Forest Goblin Infantry. So I spent all of that time in 5th edition wondering when they would finally release Forest Goblin Infantry. And when they didn't, I gotta say I was a little bit disappointed. But yeah, there you go. At least we have these ones. These Kev Adams Forest Goblins are kind of wonderful, and maybe they're good enough for our purposes. Certainly, now that I've gotten my hands on a few of these guys, they are as adorable in the flesh as you can imagine. Plus, they look really good in bright colors, and the hair squig is just hilarious. So, speaking of bright colors, we are starting with Striking Scorpion Green, which is my color of choice for the skin. And then over this, we will be working quite a lot with bone colors because actually, this guy's armor primarily, quite fittingly, is made out of bone. Whatever equipment he could, I guess, scavenge from the battlefield or from the remains of his past victims, all of these would primarily be used as his equipment. He does have rather nice buckskin shoes, which I guess, if you're going to be tramping around in a rainforest, the last thing you want to be is barefoot because there's plenty of spiky, venomous, bitey things that you'll be walking all over the place. And forest goblins would know all about that, right? So this guy has a pair of shoes. Unfortunately, most of his unit won't have pairs of shoes on, but such is life. It's good to be in charge sometimes. So I'm going to be putting on Skeleton Horde contrast paint over his bony bits, of which there are many in many different configurations. Front, back, even the haft, the little hilt of his dagger is a bone as well. I'm not sure if you can see that. I'll point it out when I get there. Yeah, there we go, this little thing. So that's a bone as well, because that's just a very major part of their look. And I kind of like the way this brightens up the orc and goblin color scheme. It's nice that actually when it comes to their equipment, the vast majority of orcs and of forest goblin equipment is actually bone colored. It's got these tiny little skulls on the side as well, kind of odd looking and very very small for skulls. So maybe he's run afoul of one of the pygmy tribes that used to be in the lore before that stuff became a little bit taboo for Games Workshop to mention in official sources. It's just not how it's done today. But back in the day, I think it was perfectly acceptable for them to discuss these things. Let's do the squig's teeth as well. That's the way the squig holds on to the top of the head of the goblin, with little bitey pointy teeth. And then there's the question of what then to do the color of his hair. Probably red. While, generally speaking, painting forest goblins does give us carte blanche to introduce all sorts of bizarre colors into the color schemes. I think generally speaking, we have an understanding of what works best in contrast with green goblin skin. Bright red is always a good choice. So let's use that for his weapon, his little tomahawk. And I intend to do the blade of it in metal. Although making it obsidian might be interesting, but it doesn't really make sense because of the way the axe is fashioned. So never mind. Let's do it. Let's do it as a sort of like off silver coppery color that I think would work with the construction of it. If it was a stone axe, I would be perfectly happy to do it as an obsidian or volcanic glass kind of thing. Obsidian being volcanic glass, of course. So using that interesting sort of emerald green, black, smoky range of color. But because of the way this is clearly an axe head with an eyelet through which the shaft of his axe is driven, I think we might have to paint this as metal because it will only be fitting to respect, the sort of equipment as modeled onto this figure. Also because as a champion, this weapon would kind of set him apart a little bit. Maybe he traded it, maybe he stole it, maybe he pillaged it, or maybe he just fashioned it himself after getting hold of a chunk of metal of some dwarf's breastplate or something, and fashioned a capable weapon for himself. I mean, I use capable in the in the loosest possible way because this is still a goblin, and goblins had quite the anemic stat line, unfortunately, especially rank and file goblins. And champions would be slightly better, but generally speaking, most goblins had a lowly weapon skill of 2. That would be out of 10, by the way. And for reference, an average human is 3. A dwarf is 4, elf is 4, so on. So being 2 was actually really pretty low down this totem pole, so to speak, metaphorically. So yeah, it was a tough life being a goblin, but they did have spiders, and spiders really did help them in the aggressive, offensive output capability. They were able to dish out poisonous attacks, which made them nominally strength 4, which wasn't bad. Strength 4 was it puts them into the realm of things like ogres and so on. So that's a decent amount of strength. And the rider himself, of course, would carry a spear, which really helped a lot. I was never really one for giving my forest goblin spider riders bows. Most of the time, their arrow fire was fairly ineffective because while goblins are better shots than they are at close combat, they were weapons. They were ballistic skill 3, bow skill 3, close combat weapon skill 2. So they were slightly better shots than they were fighters at close combat, but it never really achieved much in my experience, or my limited experience, I should say, with these guys. Just a little bit unfortunate because boy, would these guys try. Up until the point their morale broke, then they sort of just all legged it at once away from the enemy. But such is the life of a goblin. So his hair is done, and then you can sort of see that glorious squig face underneath. He's also got these weird hold fast tentacles, which I think I will pick out in purple. Magos purple would be my choice because I think that sort of slightly weird organic kind of color would really bring out a little bit of personality in this chap. So let's do that. Magos purple. It's a kind of odd fleshy color which befits a name like Magos. Obviously, Magos refers to gene stealers, so that would be highly appropriate for something that's kind of fleshy and organic. If a little bit of the red gets onto it, that's kind of okay. We will touch up any bits that are a little bit too egregious later, but for now I think this works just fine. So our strange little squiggly beast is coming along nicely, and I think we'll get to move on to, well, I need to fix that ear at some point. That really should be bright green, but we can fix that a little bit later when the surrounding areas have dried a little bit. Contrast paint As always, you work in layers. You try to work in sections so that you don't, have your paint running around too much. In the past, I've suffered a little bit for this, which is why I now have my handy dandy hairdryer on standby. But not to worry. If I decide to use that hairdryer, I'll be sure to mute the volume so it doesn't kill your ears. Well, I'll probably just cut away for a short time and then come back onto it. Right, so he's coming along. Let's work on his silver now. So my usual silver, of course, is Vallejo Model Air. Favorite silver, most effective, I feel. Air works really well with staining washes over them to create various interesting metallic colors. So I'm going to drop this very quickly onto his Tomahawk blade, which, as I mentioned, we'll be doing in a sort of coppery color. I imagine it's something that he's bartered or traded, maybe from someone, or maybe stolen from a battlefield. Maybe if it's coppery colored, it could be even something more impressive like Gromrail. Back in the day, unit champions like these used to be able to be given individual magic items as well. So there's no telling what kind of a nasty weapon he might have secreted away from himself. Even though he's a lowly forest goblin, well, they're so ubiquitous that I guess they would get to pick over over lots of battlefields, stealing little bits and bobs and tokens, and sometimes they might chance upon something truly valuable. You never know, and neither would your opponent until it was too late. Such is the joy of being a goblin. People don't expect much from them. In fact, they're so numerous and so ineffective that, generally speaking, any time spent killing them is a bit of a waste. You almost feel bad about shooting your costly high elf archers at them, because every goblin could be as low as 2 points, right? At a price point where most of your high elf archers were 12. So to put it in context, your high elf had to hit and kill 6 forest goblins in order to earn his points, which is kind of difficult, right? Considering that you still had to roll to hit, and you still had to roll to wound the little blighters. They still took some killing, even though they were pointed as if they were almost negligible. I assure you, they are not negligible when you need to take the time to put an end to these horrible little blighters. So I'm going to take a little bit of this. This is silver gray, a little puddle that I took out earlier. And silver gray is my analog for my undercoat. So this allows me to clean up some of the areas that I have, inadvertently gotten some of the wash and contrast onto. And the reason why we are prepping the feathers below at his loincloth, the feathers that make up his loincloth, in this color, again, is because we are going to be applying yellow on that. And yellow is just one of those colors that doesn't stand up well to having colors beneath it, which are more vibrant and more colorful. More intense, I should say. So a little bit of a cleanup job around the bones as well with this. This is my natural highlight color, and it really helps me to take off a little bit of the green that might have gotten into some of these areas. You'll see that when I apply contrast paint in layers, sometimes I don't worry too much about getting them wholly within the lines, so to speak. Every now and then I do get little bits of adjacent colors kind of wicking their way into the surface. And the reason for this is because I usually tend to come back and apply a highlight over most of the contrast areas. The areas that turn out particularly nicely or which give me a level of contrast that I'm happy with, I tend to leave alone. But otherwise, I tend to do come in and sort of clean up a little bit more, just to make sure that the model is nice and readable from afar, because that is the golden standard of a tabletop quality miniature, which is the standard to which we'll be painting today. We might come back to him to sort of bump him up in terms of quality a little bit later, but for today, this is as far as we're going to get. So now we're going to do his shoes. He's got, like I said, really nice buckskin shoes. So the color that I'm kind of tending towards is Nazdreg yellow, which is again one of my go-to colors for really interesting leather colors. As you well know, I've probably waxed lyrical about this too many times already, but I tend to avoid neutral browns. I like using anything that's a little bit more towards the yellow spectrum, like Nazdreg yellow, or else something more towards the red spectrum. So that will be gore grunter fur instead of neutral browns like snakebite leather, which do still have their place, but I try to minimize their use so that I don't desaturate and dull large sections of the miniatures that I'm painting. When it comes to the leather of his scabbard on his little pokey knife, he's got this little knife over here. I'm trying to work out exactly what color I want to do that in. I like the idea of working in a little bit of purple into these color schemes, simply because I think purple and green mix for a really nice venomous looking combination of colors. Psychologically we read these colors as poisonous, together with yellow and black stripes, of course, kind of the quintessential bee or leather jacket wasp kind of color scheme. But for this guy, he doesn't have a lot of that going on, so I think I might try to introduce some purple into his color scheme. I think that would serve to reinforce the connection with being poisonous or venomous rather really well. Venomous being a creature that uses a poison, as opposed to poisonous where you have to eat the goblin to be affected by its poisonous nature. Anyway, so let's jump into the yellow a little bit first. Let's use this to flesh out his feathers as well as the skull on his shield, which I like to imagine, being made of kind of like an esoteric material. So let's do that. I think the rest of the shield plus the legs, I will probably shade using a purple. For this, perhaps Luxion purple might be a good choice because it's a nice, vibrant, vivid purple. But for the skull, definitely doing it in yellow makes it really eye-catching. And for this purpose, Iandan yellow is really suited for the job because it's a nice kind of rich, like almost like an egg yolk kind of yellow. That's you sort of see orange in the recesses, and that looks really attractive when paired with purple, as I hope to show you in a bit. Loincloth, yellow feathers once again for his loincloth. So even though we're using fairly bright colors on this chap, it helps to have repetitive colors. Reason being, well, first of all, so you don't have to own like 50 different colors, but also the idea that your eye naturally travels between areas with the same color, and therefore you have the ability to lead the onlooker's eye around the piece by connecting adjacent areas with very similar colors or even identical color use. And since it's on the road to drying already, I'm going to go ahead and put on a little bit of white, and I'm going to give a very quick highlight onto the top of the skull. Usually I use ice yellow for this, but since we've got it out ready to go, I figured I might as well just pop a little bit of this onto the top of the skull, just to draw the eye accordingly. Okay, so let's fix that ear. It's been bothering me for a bit, I won't lie. So let's just get this quickly done and out of the way so that we can come in with a quick highlight on his skin. Okay, so yeah, he's got the lower part of his earlobe as well as the top part over here. Okay, I'm also going to jump in and grab a little bit more of the Magos purple just to clean up the edges around the tentacles of the hair squig. It's an adorable little hair squig. There we go. Okay. So, silvers all the way around the shield and to the metal bits, so we can come back in and stain that in a while. But for now, I think I want to give the yellow a little bit more time to dry. So we'll focus on like improving his skin for now. So we had a little puddle of yellow plus Iandan yellow. Sorry. Silver gray plus Iandan yellow. We're just going to go ahead and put a little bit of our green, our striking scorpion green into that. Maybe a little bit more white, a bit more yellow. And we have something that is a working approximation of the same mix plus ice yellow. And that's good enough to serve as an initial highlight. Just to start with, when you're applying highlights, I think people get a little bit apprehensive, and rightly so, right? With applying highlights, sometimes it can be a bit daunting because you have to essentially freehand onto the surface of the model the areas that you think need a little bit more emphasis. I would recommend that what you do is you start by cleaning up areas where your initial contrast paint or your wash, if you use the base coat and wash method, start by cleaning up the areas that you feel should be brighter, that don't necessarily need the benefit of a dark shading wash. And you start by applying this in layers so that the model gets progressively neater at first, and then once all the colors are exactly where you want them to be and the model reads nice and neat and clear, you can come in and start to mix in a little bit of your lighter color in order to apply your highlight on the surface. And over time, this can give you a lot more confidence as opposed to just trying to wing it and guess where the model needs color, needs a lighter color. Generally speaking, recessed areas are darker, raised areas are lighter. That's the obvious bit. But there's also the idea that we need to respect the volumes on the surface. So what we do is we make sure that the model, if there is a crease or a crevice, those are dark. And then if you generally have a larger sort of raised area, make sure those bits are lighter. And then before you finish with your highlights, what you need to do is look at the miniature as a whole and try to work out which areas maybe need a little bit more emphasis, or which will be higher up, facing towards the light. So for example, I've identified that his fist maybe could do with a little bit more of a highlight because it is very, very high up and it's very raised towards the light. Because this is a goblin, I am completely okay with going really light to the green, as opposed to an orc, which I would want to keep, more or less dark, fairly dark. And the reason is because I think we naturally understand things which are sort of pale colored to be a little bit scrawny and weedy and a bit weaker. And goblins are definitely a bit scrawny, a bit weaker, and appear less tough. Whereas I think we understand dark surfaces to appear a little bit more resilient. Therefore, a darker green works really well for orcs. This is just mental shorthand information that I believe is wired into our brains. Nothing at all to do with real life human skin tones, just the way we kind of understand these things naturally. Like if you were to see a dark colored turtle shell, you would assume that the dark colored turtle shell was harder than, say, for example, a likewise light colored one. And I think that's just very naturally ingrained into the way our brains process these things. So there we go. Plus, the added benefit, of course, is that forest goblins tend to be tiny. So making them nice and bright and really vibrant really helps them read better on the battlefield and draws our attention to their cute little faces just before they get absolutely steamrolled by a column of dwarves, which is more than likely what would happen to every unit of forest goblins you ever brought to the table. Because, unfortunately, they were crap. As you might have guessed from the points cost, forest goblins are pretty dire in close combat. And they're pretty dire in shooting as well, because while they were strength 3 like most shooting in the game, and they had not a below average level of chance of hit to hit their opponents, the big problem unfortunately is that their range was low. And when your range is low, you tended to stack up negative modifiers to your chances to hit rather quickly. So these guys were armed, when they were armed with bows, they were armed with short bows as befits their short stature, and short bows had a range of only 16, which means that if the enemy was more than 8 inches away, yes, they use an imperial unit system for numbers. Yeah, if the enemy was more than 8 inches away, unfortunately this chap would receive a -1 to hit. And that will mean that you start stacking up a lot of penalties. It gets even worse if the target is in cover. the target, was behind a wall, for example, or the target was obscured by magic or similar, it gets increasingly hard to almost impossible for these poor little guys to reliably score hits on their targets. But you know what? These little adorable things will keep trying all the same and fail. But sometimes playing orcs and goblins meant that you had a healthy respect for just the spectacle of the game, and bringing them along to a battlefield was sometimes, its own reward, because these are adorable little miniatures, and frankly, they don't get seen enough on tables. So I'm going to drop this wash over the metal. This is Goblin Flesh, which is kind of like an older shade. I don't think there is an equivalent. I don't know. Well, it's probably Reclan Flesh shade, isn't it? For the newer range of Citadel shades. I'm using Reclan Flesh. No, I'm using Goblin Flesh because I still have a lot of it lying around. But yeah, it's pretty close to Reclan Flesh shade now that I look at it. And I think that's perfectly good. A little bit of a coppery kind of look, a bit of a patina on it, making the metal look as if it's either poorly cared for, as forest goblin equipment is wont to be, or else it's fairly low quality steel, which is also very appropriate for forest goblins, because one of the things that characterized forest goblins was the fact that they had fairly low levels of technology, and therefore a lot of their equipment will either be scavenged or traded, and for our purposes, visually separating them from the slightly more militaristic and warlike orcs with better equipment and who actually forge their own stuff, that really brings the point across and enhances that world building. So there is a row of thongs holding together this section of bone. I'm just picking them out in a bit of red, just so that it catches the eye accordingly, but not too much, because we don't want to introduce too many colors into this miniature. I think the time has come for purple. So let's see how this goes. Now, the color I'm going to use is Luxion Purple. And if you're living in Asia, you might have had trouble getting hold of this color initially, probably because there's probably some cosmetic thing that bears the name Luxion or similar. But Games Workshop initially was unable to bring these into Singapore, and that was a bit of a shame, because this is far and away, in my opinion, the best looking purple that they make. So let's drop some of this. Ooh, it's still a bit wet. Okay, cool. We're going to take a hairdryer break, as I mentioned. See you in a bit. Alright guys, we are back and we are ready to purple this guy up. So with a fine brush, we're going to be adding this to the flat of his shield. And I've done nothing to the Luxion Purple other than to add a little bit of water to it, so that it flows a little bit better and it's not overly intense. As you can see, the purple that's appearing on the shield is kind of awesome. I really like this color. So carefully layer it onto the field of his shield, and going right over the spider legs. This is a custom shield, by the way. I put it together using some, I think, elements from a banner, from the spider banner, because I like the idea that their command group would bear a little bit of similarity with the sigils that they would be carrying on their shields. Kind of ties everything together. So yeah, purple going right around that skull. What I want to do is to make it so that when you look at the shield, you see the skull first, because it's so eye-catching. But then as you look at it, you sort of appreciate the fact that there's a spider motif that's built around it. And then the other area that I thought would benefit from purple would be the the sort of leather scabbard for his little like stabby dagger over here, his secondary weapon, which to my mind makes this, he's probably like a really rich goblin, right? This guy must be doing really well if he's got two weapons. And his dagger actually looks pretty swanky. It's actually got a tiny little spider onto there as well. I'm wondering whether I want to paint that like a real spider or not. We'll see. We'll pick him out a little bit later on. So one of the downsides of trying to do these models, to a standard that I'm happy with, is that I've had to go looking around for pictures of these online. And because forest goblins are such a rare species, unfortunately, you don't get to see many pictures online of these models painted, unfortunately. And that's a real shame because these guys are so cute. They are, in my opinion, one of the best looking goblins that you can get. I like the night goblins as much as anybody else does, but there's something special about forest goblins because they're so unique and they're so underrepresented both in the lore as well as in just pictures online, which is a shame. So a bit more purple. What I'm doing is I'm emphasizing the area below and leaving the top part relatively light in comparison. So you get a natural fade from the bottom of the shield to the top. And then we are going to come back in and improve that a little bit more later on. I do want to sneak a little bit of Nazdreg yellow onto the inside of the shield right now, however. So a note about how I've assembled this guy. I like having the entire model assembled as close to one piece as possible when I paint. I know this is not exactly possible with some of the later miniatures that have come out from Games Workshop. A lot of them are way too complex, and the ones that I've done as commissions have convinced me that you really need to be adept at leaving some of them separate as sub-assemblies. Assembling them all together may be a bad idea for your sanity. But on the other hand, for earlier miniatures like this guy, I like to try to have them as one piece as possible. And the reason for this is it's fairly simple, right? I like the idea that I get to adjust the color scheme as a whole. I get to appreciate the overall look of the miniature, and I feel that I make better decisions about color schemes if I get to see the model in its totality. I find that if I break things apart into separate sub-assemblies, while useful for reaching all the tiny little details, I often find that I either get lost a little in the details, or else I have a tendency to maybe get the balance of colors a little bit wrong, or I fail to get things like the direction of light quite so clear on the miniature. So yeah, where possible, I like to fully assemble miniatures, even though it might make painting a little bit more difficult. Okay, so I've got the vast majority of him, at least colored. I'm really going in to emphasize, say, little details like these weird little skulls on his side again. Again, I have no idea what skulls these are. Maybe they're monkey skulls. They're really, really small and cute. But there you go. I guess on some level, it does make sense that the only thing that maybe a forest goblin can handily defeat in combat is a small monkey. And therefore, these are the ones that get incorporated into his clothing. But there you go. Okay. I'm going to jump back in with a little bit more Guilliman flesh. Or Guilliman flesh shade if you prefer. The colors are, for all intents and purposes, identical in my opinion. And then drop a little bit more of this onto the harder to see sections of this dagger and scabbard. Okay, the last thing I kind of want to do is to come back in and highlight the legs of that spider on his shield to help them stand out a little bit more. So to do this, I think I'm going to start by mixing a fairly light mix of silver gray with Luxion purple. So something like this. When I mix contrast paint into other colors for highlights, I tend to go really quite bold with it. And the reason is because my next step is usually to try to come in and cut back into it using the original contrast paint. If this is required, if for example the highlights become a little bit too jarring or a little bit messy, that's usually a good way to fix the problem by coming back in with contrast paint and to touch that up where needed. But if it looks just fine, then the option is either to, if it's too harsh, to come back in and mix a little bit more of the contrast paint into it to create a mid-tone between your highlight and your shade, and then you can sort of come in and ensure that it blends together nicely if needed. Or if it looks just fine, it's okay. If it's not punchy enough, you can come in and with a little bit more of the lightening color, and that helps the color scheme pop ever so slightly more. As I have here, as I have done here, I've put in a little bit more of the lighter color, silver gray, into the Luxion blue, purple, to get a more eye-catching highlight. So now I'm thinking about that spider friend that he's got over here. And I think I might do him as an actual living spider. Give my champion a bit of a familiar. Why not? This certainly suits the theme of orcs and goblins, who do like their pets, to be fair. Whether they're squigs or hair squigs or similar. Plus, world building wise, it really does extend the idea of the fact that this forest goblin is living in a forest, which, as we all know, are full of living creatures, sometimes too full of living creatures. Singapore is, in fact, a rainforest, and we are very well acquainted with the challenges of living in an environment that insects claim for their own, all sorts of creepy crawlies, and which is why you'll never see a Singaporean sit on grass willingly, not if they were wearing, nice clothing. Because who knows what might be running around, scrabbling around in the muck, crawling up your pants and so on. It's one of the lasting memories of mine that I would see lots of people happily, like when I was in university, and you see lots of exchange students, and they would happily be sitting on the ground at the university, like grass patches. And I was like, no, we have centipedes and scorpions. No, we have snakes and spiders. No, do not do that. And to be fair, most of the exchange students that did it were of Scandinavian origin, so they probably never saw. They never knew what a millipede was or a centipede. And I can tell you, once they have their first encounter, probably that would fix any desire of theirs to go sitting happily on the ground, because then there be horror show insects crawling around. Don't do that. Take a bit of advice from the locals. If there are bugs, beware. Putting like ice yellow highlights, because I felt that it could be a little bit punchier. Ice yellow highlights around the shield. Well, the thing about orcs and goblins is that their shields are really an opportunity to introduce very non-standard colors, right? And those are really ideal for drawing the eye. Therefore, it makes sense to spend a little bit more time on them, getting them just right. I'm now adding a little bit of detail to the spider. I like the idea that on some level, the spider that's crawling around on his weapon is maybe the same spider that inspired the design on his shield. And he's just really paying homage to his little friend. There we go. Might need to clean up that highlight a bit. But for the most part, we have immortalized this little spidery friend over there on the scabbard of his weapon. And I think he's looking pretty good. So, now the challenge next that we are going to be looking at is figuring out how we're going to be doing his eye, or his eyes, because from what I can tell, they don't appear to have been sculpted in, which is a thing that could happen. because most of these, I mean, these miniatures from this era were all sculpted by hand. So sculptors did sometimes make mistakes, no matter how good they were. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start by taking a bit of ice yellow. And ice yellow is a really good color for this because it's nice and thick, right? And we're going to try to put a little dot inside his eye socket, hopefully. Something like that. These were the models that were always hardest to get the eyes right because, well, they didn't sculpt in the eyeballs. Let's try that again. Okay, that will do for one side. Re-emphasize the right side. Something like that. And then I think we'll come in and we'll shade the socket a little bit. And that will help us define the margins of the eye. A little bit more of a highlight around the edges of the feathers using ice yellow, now that we have it out. It's really eye-catching colors on this tiny little guy. Maybe it's easier if you see without that background. A little bit more Guilliman flesh around the axe blade, just to reinforce the shape a little bit around the highlights that have been added. Cut back those highlights and blend them in. There we go. A little bit more on the top. So it looks ever so slightly rusty, but still very well loved. And then here's the hard bit, a bit of red to try to clean up the eye again a little bit. Ooh, this isn't easy, is it? You always know I'm concentrating because I'm not saying anything. So a little bit of red with a little bit more of a darker point to it. And the last thing I kind of want to do is to grab a bit of that Mega's purple, add a bit of white to it, or off-white, my silver gray, and clean it up a little bit because that red on it on the surface is slightly distracting. Just like that. And I think we're good. Yep, I think he's looking pretty swank. I am happy with this for now. I might come in and refine his eyes a little bit later, but I think it'd probably be a little bit easier to do it off camera, I'm not gonna lie. This is an extremely small miniature, and like I said, the eyeballs aren't actually sculpted in there. So it might be easier to, come back in carefully with a much finer brush. But for now, I think he's looking pretty handsome. So yeah, thank you for joining me. Like, comment, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you again soon. Bye. A couple more angles just to show him off. The angle wasn't great just now, to be fair. And on his back, together with his little spider friend, I think he's looking pretty good. Cheers.